The courtroom did not just fall silent, it collapsed into a kind of oppressive stillness that felt almost physical. It wasn't the ordinary pause of legal proceedings or the quiet anticipation of a ruling. It was the moment when a carefully constructed version of reality begins to fracture under the weight of something far more unsettling. Only 11 words had been read aloud, yet they carried enough force to shift the emotional temperature of the entire room. Make him tear up when discussing Diana. The line came not as a dramatic accusation, but as a calm, clinical reading of private correspondence presented as evidence. Judge Margaret Thornberry delivered it without emphasis, without emotion, yet its impact was immediate and irreversible. Across the courtroom, reactions were subtle at first. Pens stopped moving. Cameras remained still. Reporters, trained to document even the smallest detail, hesitated for the first time that morning. Then all attention shifted toward the witness box. Prince Harry sat rigidly at first, maintaining the posture of someone trained for public scrutiny. Shoulders squared, jaw locked, eyes forward. But something in that composure began to break. It started with a twitch in his expression, a tightening that betrayed internal conflict. Then his hands, resting on his knees, curled slowly into fists so tightly that the knuckles drained of color. What followed was not a dramatic outburst, but something far more human and far more unsettling. His composure didn't explode. It unraveled, gradually, visibly, and without the protection of royal distance. He lowered his head, as though trying to physically retreat from the moment unfolding around him. In that courtroom, even breathing seemed intrusive. Witnesses later described the silence as unnatural, as though the room itself had been stripped of sound. Harry's shoulders began to shake. His hands rose slowly toward his face. And then, in a gesture that felt almost involuntary, he covered it completely. What followed was a sound that no legal transcript could properly capture, a broken, suppressed expression of distress that disrupted the formal rhythm of the court. This was not the controlled vulnerability of interviews or documentaries. This was something raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal. A man confronting not just evidence, but the interpretation of his most intimate memories being reframed under legal scrutiny. The courtroom narrative up to that point had been procedural. Lawyers exchanged documents. The judge clarified statements. The press observed with professional detachment. But everything changed the moment those 11 words entered the record. Because they did not merely describe communication, they suggested intent. The idea that grief, particularly grief tied to Princess Diana, could be consciously referenced or shaped within private exchanges, transformed the tone of the entire proceeding. Harry's reaction became the focal point. He was no longer just a witness. He had become part of the evidence being interpreted in real time by everyone present. His attorney immediately requested a recess, citing emotional distress. The request was denied, not out of indifference, but in accordance with procedural requirements that demanded continuity of testimony. The judge's voice, however, had shifted, still controlled, but noticeably less detached than before. Outside the courthouse, the situation escalated rapidly. News outlets began broadcasting fragmented updates before full details were even confirmed. Headlines formed in real time. A collapse in court, a message that changed everything, a testimony that disrupted proceedings. But inside the courtroom, time felt different, slower, heavier. Each second stretched as more evidence was prepared for presentation. Harry remained seated, but no longer in the way he had entered. Something in his posture had changed completely. It was no longer resistance or composure, it was endurance. And the room understood, without needing it said aloud, that what was unfolding was no longer just a legal matter. It had become something far more psychologically complex, a confrontation between private emotion and public interpretation. As the proceedings continued, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from procedural discipline into something far more psychologically charged. What had begun as structured legal argument was now unfolding like a layered reconstruction of private communications, timelines, and emotional interpretations presented as evidence. Judge Thornberry proceeded to outline the next segment of material, cautioning the room that the contents were part of a broader evidentiary sequence. The tone remained formal, but the weight of what was being introduced made it increasingly difficult for the gallery to maintain emotional detachment. The focus moved toward a collection of private messages and documented exchanges that allegedly formed part of a larger pattern of communication over several years. According to the presentation, these materials were being used not to draw immediate conclusions, but to establish context around behavior, narrative framing, and public presentation strategies. At the center of this segment was a reconstructed timeline spanning multiple years, presented visually in court. It mapped personal milestones, professional transitions, and periods where public appearances and private movements were being compared side by side. The intent, as described in the hearing, was to highlight perceived inconsistencies between public narratives and private chronology. The courtroom screens displayed structured data, dates, locations, travel windows, and communication intervals. Each point was introduced as part of a broader analytical framework rather than isolated accusation. Still, the effect on the room was unmistakable. The more structured the presentation became, the heavier the implications felt. Observers noted that Prince Harry remained largely motionless throughout this phase. His earlier visible reaction had given way to a more contained stillness. He was no longer reacting outwardly, but internally the strain was evident in his fixed gaze and rigid posture. The evidence being discussed included references to conversations that, according to the presentation, reflected strategic thinking around public messaging. These messages were interpreted by the presenting side as discussions about how emotional narratives might be framed for audience impact during interviews and public appearances. Legal representatives for the opposing side objected repeatedly, emphasizing that interpretation was being conflated with fact. They argued that private communication, when removed from context, could be misread and overanalyzed in ways that distort intent. The judge acknowledged the objection but allowed the continuation of the presentation, noting that context would be addressed through cross-examination. As the material progressed, the courtroom was introduced to what was described as a communication pattern analysis. This segment attempted to categorize messages into thematic clusters: emotional language, public relations framing, and personal reflection. The structure was clinical, almost academic, yet the subject matter made it emotionally charged. The phrase narrative construction appeared repeatedly in the presentation. It was used to describe how personal experiences were allegedly reframed for public consumption over time. While the term itself was neutral in academic contexts, its application here gave it a far more provocative undertone. Throughout this section, the emotional center of the courtroom remained unchanged: Harry's silence. He did not interrupt. He did not respond, but his stillness carried its own weight, as though every new piece of information was being absorbed without visible resistance, but with clear internal impact. At one point, the judge paused the presentation briefly to allow a procedural clarification. Even in that pause, no one in the room relaxed. The tension had already become self-sustaining, no longer dependent on active testimony to remain present. When proceedings resumed, the focus shifted again, this time toward interpretation of intent behind communication styles. Analysts in the presentation suggested that certain emotional references and messages could be viewed as deliberately structured rather than spontaneous. This claim immediately drew objections, reinforcing the divide between interpretation and evidence. Despite the legal back and forth, the narrative momentum of the courtroom did not slow. Each segment built upon the previous one, layering context upon context until the distinction between documentation and implication became increasingly difficult for observers to separate. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the trial had moved beyond isolated claims. It had become an examination of perception itself, how private communication is understood when placed under institutional and public scrutiny. The third phase of the proceedings carried a noticeably different weight. If earlier segments had focused on timelines and communication patterns, this portion moved deeper into interpretation, how private exchanges, when assembled together, could be framed as part of a broader behavioral narrative. The court was presented with a series of categorized materials that, according to the submission, illustrated evolving strategies in public communication. These were not introduced as standalone accusations, but as interconnected fragments intended to show continuity over time. The presentation emphasized structure, consistency, and repetition as key analytical markers. Legal counsel for the defense immediately challenged the framing, arguing that selective grouping of private messages risked distorting intent. They maintained that emotional language, when extracted from personal context, could appear calculated even when it was not. The objection underscored a central tension in the courtroom: interpretation versus provable fact. Judge Thornberry allowed the material to proceed, but reminded both sides that final conclusions would depend on corroboration, not presentation style. Her tone remained controlled, though the gravity of the material had clearly shifted the emotional rhythm of the court. At this stage, the focus turned toward how personal narratives are shaped when filtered through media exposure. The presentation argued that public-facing interviews, statements, and appearances often follow a structured progression: carefully timed disclosures, thematic consistency, and repetition of emotional anchors designed to reinforce audience engagement. Visual exhibits were displayed showing parallel comparisons between private communication drafts and later public statements. The intent, according to the presenting side, was to highlight similarities in phrasing and emotional structure. However, the defense reiterated that resemblance does not automatically imply orchestration, cautioning against overinterpretation. Despite the legal debate, the atmosphere in the courtroom became increasingly psychological in nature. The discussion was no longer limited to what was said, but how it was said, when it was said, and how it was later received by the public. Prince Harry remained seated throughout, his presence increasingly subdued. He was no longer visibly reacting to each individual claim. Instead, he appeared locked into a prolonged state of internal processing, as though each new exhibit added another layer to a reality he was being forced to reconsider. At one point, the presentation shifted toward emotional framing within public storytelling. It explored how grief, vulnerability, and personal history are often communicated in high-profile interviews. The argument presented was that emotional authenticity and structured messaging are not mutually exclusive in modern media environments, but can exist simultaneously. This segment proved particularly contentious. The defense argued that such framing risked reducing genuine emotional experience into strategic calculation. The presenting side countered that analyzing structure does not negate authenticity, it simply examines form. The judge intervened briefly to remind the court that emotional interpretation must not replace evidentiary standards. Her statement subtly recentered the proceedings, but the emotional undercurrent remained unchanged. As the day progressed, the courtroom's focus increasingly shifted from isolated communications to broader behavioral interpretation. Analysts in the presentation emphasized recurring themes, suggesting that certain narrative patterns appeared consistently across multiple years of documented material. However, the defense continued to stress fragmentation and context loss. They argued that personal relationships, especially under public scrutiny, cannot be accurately reconstructed through partial records alone. Despite these objections, the cumulative effect of the evidence was undeniable in shaping the courtroom atmosphere. The case was no longer being viewed through a narrow legal lens. It had expanded into something closer to a study of perception, memory, and media influence. By the end of this phase, no definitive conclusions had been reached, but something more subtle had occurred. The boundaries between private life and public narrative had been placed under intense scrutiny. And as the court prepared to move into the next stage, it was clear that the most sensitive material had not yet been fully introduced. The fourth stage of the proceedings marked a clear shift in tone. The earlier focus on timelines and communication patterns now gave way to a broader examination of influence, perception, and the way personal narratives are shaped under sustained public attention. The courtroom, already tense, seemed to settle into a deeper kind of silence, one that suggested anticipation rather than shock. The presentation moved into what was described as the emotional framing layer of the evidence. This section aimed to explore how personal experiences are communicated when filtered through interviews, public statements, and media appearances. It did not present conclusions outright, but instead highlighted patterns in language, timing, and emphasis across multiple public-facing moments. According to the material shown in court, emotional themes such as grief, identity, and family relationships were repeatedly structured in ways that aligned with broader narrative arcs. The argument being explored was not whether emotions were genuine, but how they were packaged, sequenced, and delivered in public contexts. The defense immediately pushed back, stressing that emotional expression in public life is naturally influenced by preparation, media training, and external pressure. They argued that structured communication does not automatically imply manipulation, especially when dealing with individuals who have lived under constant global scrutiny. Despite the objections, the court allowed the presentation to continue. Judge Thornberry maintained that all interpretations would ultimately be weighed against cross-examination and supporting documentation. Her reminders were steady and procedural, but even she appeared aware of the emotional sensitivity surrounding the material. At this point, the courtroom dynamics had changed noticeably. The earlier intensity had evolved into something quieter but more psychologically dense. Observers were no longer reacting visibly to each new claim. Instead, they were absorbing the cumulative weight of the narrative being constructed piece by piece. Prince Harry remained seated, largely motionless. His earlier visible distress had subsided into a subdued stillness. He was no longer reacting in outward bursts, but instead appeared to be absorbing each segment in silence, as though trying to process multiple layers of interpretation simultaneously. The presentation then introduced comparative examples of public interviews and private written material, focusing on similarities in phrasing and thematic structure. The intent, as explained in court, was to examine whether emotional messaging followed consistent patterns across different formats of communication. However, the defense reiterated that consistency alone does not establish intent. They emphasized that individuals often repeat phrases or emotional expressions naturally, especially when discussing deeply personal experiences over time. The debate between pattern recognition and interpretive overreach became one of the central tensions of the day. As proceedings continued, attention also turned toward the broader impact of media narratives on private relationships. The presentation suggested that once personal experiences enter the public sphere, they often take on a life of their own, shaped by editing, repetition, and audience interpretation. In that environment, distinguishing between original intent and public perception becomes increasingly complex. The judge briefly paused the session to ensure clarity in how certain exhibits were being contextualized. Her intervention underscored the need to separate analytical framing from definitive conclusions. Even so, the emotional atmosphere in the courtroom remained heavy and unbroken. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the case had moved beyond individual statements or isolated messages. It had become an examination of how personal identity is constructed, interpreted, and reconstructed once it becomes part of a global narrative. As the court prepared for the final phase of presentation, there was a shared understanding among those present that the remaining material would likely carry even greater emotional and institutional weight. Part 5, Rewritten. The final phase of the proceedings arrived with an almost unsettling sense of anticipation. By this point, the courtroom was no longer reacting in bursts of shock or disbelief. Instead, it had settled into a heavy, controlled silence, one that reflected emotional exhaustion more than detachment. Everyone present understood that what came next would not simply add to the narrative, but potentially redefine it. The presentation shifted toward what was described as the structural impact analysis of the collected material. Unlike earlier segments that focused on timelines or messaging patterns, this portion attempted to examine the broader consequences of sustained narrative framing across personal and public life. According to the material presented, repeated emotional themes and structured messaging, when amplified through global media platforms, can gradually reshape public perception of individuals, often blurring the line between lived experience and curated storytelling. The argument being explored was not confined to one relationship or one set of communications, but extended to how modern public figures are interpreted in real time by a global audience. The defense strongly objected to this framing, arguing that it crossed into speculative theory rather than factual evidence. They maintained that while media influence is undeniable, it cannot be used to retroactively reinterpret private intent. The courtroom briefly became tense again as both sides clashed over the boundaries between analysis and assumption. Judge Thornberry intervened to restore order, reiterating that the court's role was not to accept narrative conclusions, but to evaluate admissible evidence. Her reminder brought procedural discipline back into the room, but it did little to soften the emotional weight already established. At this stage, the focus subtly shifted away from individual communications and toward their cumulative psychological effect. The presentation argued that prolonged exposure to public reinterpretation can influence personal identity, decision-making, and even relationships over time. Each message, each interview, each public moment was now being viewed as part of a larger, interconnected system. Prince Harry remained present throughout, though visibly drained. His earlier emotional reactions had given way to a quiet stillness that suggested both fatigue and internal struggle. He did not interrupt, nor did he respond to any of the claims being structured around him. Instead, he remained fixed in place, as though anchored by the proceedings themselves. Observers noted that the courtroom atmosphere had become almost reflective in nature. It was no longer driven by surprise, but by the slow accumulation of implications. Each segment reinforced the last, creating a layered narrative that was difficult to separate into clear boundaries of truth and interpretation. The presentation concluded by emphasizing uncertainty rather than resolution. It highlighted that while patterns and correlations could be observed, interpretation always carries limitations when separated from full context. This acknowledgement introduced a final layer of ambiguity into the proceedings. As the judge signaled the end of the session, there was no immediate sense of closure. Instead, what lingered was a quiet tension, an awareness that the case had expanded far beyond its initial legal framing into something more complex, involving perception, narrative construction, and the fragile boundaries between public image and private reality. The courtroom emptied slowly, without celebration or resolution. And as the doors closed behind the final attendees, what remained was not a conclusion, but a lingering question about how much of what is seen, heard, and believed can ever be fully separated from interpretation.